Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I know some people are still getting settled. Are joined here for the future we want, the change we need, planning for a post-pandemic city. This event this afternoon is hosted by a number of different groups at Simon Fraser University, including SFU Public Square, the City Program, SFU Urban Studies, the Woodward's Van City Office of Community Engagement, and the City of Vancouver. And our purpose here today is to turn our minds again in the pandemic context to a long-term plan for the City of Vancouver. So as everybody gets settled for today, I'd like to ask everyone to please mute themselves and perhaps to turn off their videos, because we are very numerous today and we want to make sure that we are focused on the people who are speaking so that we can carry the discussion forward. So as you're getting settled, there is closed captioning available for today's event. And where is that, Andy? If you can click, there's a CC button at the bottom of your screen. It should be on the right. Also, please take a minute to make sure that your name that shows up on the Zoom screen is indeed your full name. We want to be present here today as much as possible. Our chat is open, so please do use the chat window. You can also take a look at the chat window for various kinds of technical assistance that you might need in order to really take advantage of the discussion today. One of the really exciting things that you will see is our ASL interpreter. So we have signers, and if that is something that you can use, you can actually make that work best for you. How? By pinning the video of the signers. And if you need help in doing that, please just drop a note to the tech help in the chat window, and they will explain exactly how to do that. So in order to get us started today on a good path, it is my pleasure to introduce Gabriel George, cultural leader and member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and also an SFU alumnus, as he has kindly agreed to offer us words of welcome to his territory to begin our dialogue today. Gabriel.
Thank you. Can everyone see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Tashwalap na akoitel na siyam na siya na chonchonitam at melsteo I quinish gwalwin quanziquits nala siyam eatsin siatala to siwan as at humathquium e squamish e salewatas melsteo Nikwas emix ashton ishwa atmit at pankupa at tamuch na siwan as Nikwas quanatis ashton qua I hali at tamuch it qua honhonitum as Nikwas halsiais at nemish sklits quath yahwith it alap at kalsiais heights ewish heights kasi again, my name is Gabriel George, and I'm a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, but I have family ties into Musqueam and Squamish as well. And in my opening remarks, I was using the Hunkaminam language. It's one of two languages that comes from this land that's now known as Vancouver, the other being Squamish Snatchum. And I was acknowledging the ancestors of the Musqueam people and the ancestors of the Squamish people and the Tsleil-Waututh people, and acknowledging as well the great harms that our people had suffered from the newcomers. When you think about 1492, that's the number people put on colonialism in the Americas. but it was really the late 1700s, almost 300 years after Columbus, that the first ship sailed into Burrard Inlet. And my tsleil family, my tsleil family, they were kind of excited because they heard about these newcomers and how fair they were. And when they heard the ship was coming, they went out and they were surprised because some of them were darker than us. It was a Spanish ship that first pulled into our waters. And it's a mixed blessing. When you look at North America, there's over 60 indigenous languages, and half of them pre-contact, 60 indigenous languages, and half of them, more than half of them, are in British Columbia. And it's the abundance of this land. Canada is one of the top countries in the world, and I would argue it has a lot to do with the natural resources. So the wealth that my people, the Hualmuch people, the original people of these lands that we call the Americas, came from the bounty of this land, and the wealth that millions of other people have since come onto our respective territories is from that same place, the bounty of the land. And because colonization was perfected, they learned, because they tried in the past to fight the indigenous people, and often they couldn't win on their own lands. And they learned that it was the resources and disease that would level that playing field. And so one of the biggest atrocities that happened to my Tsleil-Waututh people was the disease. Before 20 years before we saw the first ship come, we were decimated. We were wiped down to from about 12 to 15,000 people down to a couple of dozen from smallpox and from diseases. And then with the ensuing industry, everything was taken away. Our people hunted in what's now known as the City of Vancouver. They put street names on our trails. Thurlow Street and Robson Street were our hunting trails. Sanok, False Creek is where we harvested coyotes, the elk. And so the decimation of the environment, if the city of Vancouver kept 10% of that old growth forest, it would be a World Heritage Site, in my opinion. My late grandfather, Chief Dan George, talked about how the wolves were chased out of the land and how that broke his heart, because we were people of Burrard Inlet, but we were also people of Stakaya, the wolf. And so you imagine if if 90% of your family was wiped out, the impact that that would leave you, the grief, the trauma. And this is before the residential schools even took over. The language that I'm using, Hunkaminam, is from about Langley and Maple Ridge down into Vancouver. And in our language family, I think there's about 10,000 people now, and there's no fluent speakers, no mother tongue speakers. And that's because of the residential schools. So we have to imagine a Vancouver where our people are front and center again, where we're represented in our lands, where we're represented in a dignified and respectful way. You see more of other cultures, other indigenous cultures in Vancouver than you do of our own Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish. And so this is an important work, and I'm happy to be a part of it. And I come here with these words to bring you behind the curtain, not to bestow guilt, not to point fingers, but recognizing that there is work to be done. And there's so many discrepancies between all of Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. We are lower down in every statistic: our mortality rate, our education rate. Our Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish youth, the justice area that our people are captured within. Our youth represent 35% of those in the system. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And we're not asking for favoritism. We're asking for that playing field to be leveled. And so I encourage you in your work and as you move forward to continue to make room. And I want to acknowledge the City of Vancouver. In my capacity, currently, I'm the Director of Treaty Lands and Resources for Tsleil-Waututh Nation. It's a new position for me. My former position was Manager of Culture and Language. And through that, I established many relationships. And I believe that the City of Vancouver is trying. And if you could bring the message and work you do to the other municipalities in BC, because some of the impediments that we face in our work, in our business, in our struggle to be self-sufficient again comes from other municipalities. But today, I want to leave you with a message that we must do this work together with love and with compassion. I mentioned my late grandfather, Chief Dan George, and the work that he did despite being put in residential schools. And he literally, the first day he arrived, he was beat for speaking the only language he knew. And as a result, him and his siblings, they spoke 3, 4, 5 languages. And then you get to my parents' generation, one language speaker in our family. My late uncle, Robert George, spoke Squamish Bobby George. And you get to my generation, no speakers. And my grandfather suffered all the harms of colonialism. He saw the lands cleared. He saw the animals chased out. He saw industry come in. He saw the time when we weren't free to leave our reserves. There had to be a reason. We didn't have the right to consult. Under the potlatch laws, our culture was illegal. We could get put in jail for our practices. For what I'm wearing here today, I could end up in jail in New Westminster, and some of my family did. But despite all this, I look at my grandfather and his work to go from that boy that was beat in residential school and all the different things that he witnessed. And when he reached a point of celebrity in his work, he used that to teach and enlighten and connect with people. And he wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. You look at his speech, the Chief Dan George Centennial speech, the 100th birthday of Canada, and he talks about how he got drunk on firewater, very drunk. And so publicly, he talked about his addictions, which were a direct result of colonial traumas. And that vulnerability and that compassion and that willingness he had to share our ways allowed him to connect to many people and impact change. And so I ask you to have compassion, to step outside of your comfort zone. Often the rules, what you need, the tools you need are in place to make change, but we don't want to break the norms, the comfort levels. And sometimes it just takes speaking up, and we need it because our people are dying. It's life and death for Huelmach Melsteo. I'm very grateful. I don't have any more words that I want to share, but I want to sing the song of Thanksgiving, asking our ancestors of this land for the permission to do this good work. I want to thank you, and I apologize if I've gone a little over time. I'm not sure, but I want to leave you with one last thought. Stanley Park was a significant area in our people's history. All three of our nations, Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. And there was areas of that park that was so sacred to our people that we wouldn't step ground on it. And I just want to leave that last thought with you and thank you again and encourage you to do the best you can in consideration of our Indigenous peoples, not just the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, but all Indigenous peoples, because there are many that call Vancouver home. Thank you again. Haitsepka.
Haichka. Thank you very much, Gabriel George. Not only was that a gracious welcome to start us off on a good path with respect to thinking about long-term planning in the city, but it also reflects through the stories that you shared, I think, really elegantly and eloquently, the three cross-cutting themes that the city has identified for the plan: reconciliation, equity, and resilience. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. Haitsep.
So I haven't introduced myself yet. My name is Meg Holden. I'm going to be one of your co-moderators today. I direct the Urban Studies program at SFU. I'm myself a fifth-generation immigrant in Canada and have been fortunate to call Vancouver my home for 17 years. And along with my colleagues and over 200 graduates now of our program, we have been teaching, researching, and partnering to deepen the investigation and results of urbanism from SFU Vancouver for all this time. And for 13 years, I've also been fortunate to be raising two children in a Vancouver apartment as a single mom. And I also want to introduce my co-moderator today, Andy Yan. And Andy is a Vancouver-born registered professional planner with a decade of experience in urban planning in the private sector here in town, and now director of the SFU City program. But I want to introduce Andy just for how I see him across the different positions he's held, which is, get this, Andy, as the Chicken Little of Vancouverism. Andy has never been quiet about what he sees Vancouver planning and development to be doing, including when it's heading in a bad direction. And I would note to recall some of his most important projects: his research on the $1 million line and property values, which exposed his research that exposed the problems of empty condos downtown, and questioning the family-friendly image of Vancouver downtown through his trick or treat hotspot analysis, not to be missed. Andy.
Yes, thank you. Wow, thank you so much, Meg, for that introduction. Hello, I am Andy Yan. I'm the director of the City program at Simon Fraser University, and I would like to welcome you to our event, The Future You Want, The Future We Want, The Change We Need, Planning for the Post-Pandemic City. And very much, I would like to also acknowledge that I'm speaking on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and that I think that this is, a moment in the history of our city, as perhaps we move from a city that is just barely 7 generations of settlers in this territory and into perhaps questions of what the land and the city might be for the next 7 generations. And I think that we're assembled today with this great collaboration between the City of Vancouver as well as the SFU family, that we are here today to talk about about really what planning the post-pandemic city might look like. And that I think within the words of Gabe George, that we've, I think, really begin to understand our roots in the history of the city, as well as really what that future might look like into into the future. And so that I'd like to also begin this event to really begin to acknowledge the elected officials who have joined us today. Councillor Adrian Carr, Councillor Christine Boyle, Councillor Sarah Kirby-Young, as well as Councillor Jean Swanson. And thank you very much for coming and joining us today. I should keep a few housekeeping notes, that this event is being recorded. However, we are recording the panelists. As a participant, your contribution and considerable and conversations in the breakout rooms will not be recorded. And that unfortunately we weren't able to get the closed captioning working for today's event, but we will hopefully get this for hopefully other future events.
Andy, they did show up, sorry.
Oh, did show up. Yes, it did show up. Excellent. You can turn it on and off by clicking the CC button on the black bar at the bottom of your screen. It should be to your right. And hopefully that will be working for you. As well as we are looking at and you'll see that we have ASL interpreters. To access our ASL interpreters, we suggest changing your view to gallery view and pinning the video of the active interpreter. You will need to repin the video of the active interpreter when the interpreters trade off. Instructions on how to do this will be posted in the chat. Should you need assistance with our ASL interpretation or closed captioning, please private message Access Help, and they'll be able to help us. And also a welcome to Councillor Pete Fry, as well as Councillor Michael Weeb, who is also in the in our event today, and Councillor Bly, welcome. Thank you. It's great to see this great turnout of our elected councillors for the city of Vancouver. That if you don't need ASL interpretation, we suggest viewing today's session in speaker view as you follow along. You can adjust your video settings in the top right corner of your Zoom screen. And I think that ends at least my section of the housekeeping notes. As always, on behalf of the city program, come on over and see and join us over at sfu.ca/.
Okay, let's cut the advertisement. Gratuitous, Andy.
Over to the fine professor.
Andy's going to provide an overview of what we're going to do. I just wanted to give a quick reminder, because we are a large group with, I hope, diverse ideas that we are going to share. We're going to have a lengthy breakout room opportunity where I hope that everyone will share their ideas freely, but I hope that everyone will do that respectfully. We will not have any tolerance for the promotion of violence or harm. And so if you do need to, if you do get filled up with emotion, these are emotional times and emotional topics. I've had to tell Andy to walk away from the screen before and just press mute. You can scream all you want. But while we are engaging, please be respectful. Don't assume anything about the person that you're speaking with. Take turns, do all the things that you learned in kindergarten, please, about how to engage respectfully with people in the public sphere, and we will keep it that way. Andy, how's it going to go from here?
It will go well, Meg, and I'd like to also acknowledge Councillor Dominato, who is also joining us today, and I hope I've gotten all the elected officials who have joined us. And thank you again so much. And so if I have missed you, please feel free to announce yourself in the chat, and I will give you the old shout out. So that the process for today's event, that we'll begin with a presentation by Gil Kelly. Gil Kelly is the General Manager of Planning, Urban Design, and Sustainability at the City of Vancouver. He'll start us off with a 10-minute presentation about the Vancouver Plan, Planning Vancouver Together. And then we'll also then have a 45-minute panel conversation with Gil Kelly, Junior Gosnell Myers, Adriana Laurent, and Lisa Caravaggio. And so we're hoping to begin this presentation with Gil. And I think at this point, we're going to pass it over to Gil Kelly.
Okay, so thanks, Andy. Yeah, so please do, and please do stick around for the entirety of the panel conversation, because we will have a 25-minute breakout session following that. And there will be very keen listeners amongst the senior city staff and councilors. So this is definitely the time to compose your input and think about the role that you want to have in our plan. Before we turn it over to Gil Kelly, everybody has their videos off, I hope. And I think that Rachel has a poll that we are going to ask you. Is there a poll ready to? Right. So here, if we could just get everyone's votes on the 10 Vancouver Together provisional goals and which you might be most interested in attending events on next year or having a voice on, because this is the first of a series of events and opportunities to have a voice that we are going to be co-hosting with the city. So let us know. Can you choose multiple? Yes, you can. You can choose multiple. And then Rachel, could you please show us the results of this? Okay, so, oh, well, there's quite a bit of even, well, we're interested in everything, aren't we, Andy?
Yeah, indeed. A very curious crowd here.
So developing an affordable city is definitely well, it's ties for the lead with complete, connected, and culturally vibrant neighborhoods. Well, that's very prescient of us, because those are the two events that we've planned next, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Convenient.
Great planning. Excellent. Excellent. It's a wonderful example of planning here.
Thank you. But very closely followed by creating an equitable, diverse, and inclusive city, also becoming a sustainable and carbon neutral city. There is nothing that gets short shrift, really. Okay. With that, I would like to turn it over to Gil to introduce us to where the city has come so far with Vancouver Plan. Gil?
Well, thank you, Meg, and good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, again, first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank SFU for co-hosting this, really this invitation to this critical part of the Vancouver Plan process. We're calling it phase 2. Phase 1 was kind of an open-ended listening and learning phase, and we've documented a lot of the conversation to date. But as of today, we're really launching into a new zone of conversation here, which is really to articulate the critical choices that we might face as a community, and to kind of make the future that we really desire real. And some of those will be hard choices. Some of them have very long-term implications. But when you think about us growing up as a city, taking this moment, even in a pandemic, to look into our souls and ask ourselves the question, who do we want to be? What community do we want to be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? And for our kids, and even for their kids. And as Andy alluded to, for 7 generations, can we get started on the right path in that way? And so we just really want to say today is a conversation. It's an invitation to come on in and help co-create that future with us. We as the city and as the planning department in particular will coordinate and lead that conversation. But this is really learning as we go. And in fact, in many ways, we're inventing a new kind of plan, a new kind of city strategy for the future that we haven't seen a lot of precedents for around the world. And so we're not so we're not so egotistical or vain, thinking that we already know it all. And so a lot of this is opening that conversation to kind of plumb the depths of our needs, plumb the far reaches of our imaginations, and then to coalesce and come together and formulate critical choices that this city council and its partner agencies and partners in the community will ultimately need to make to define the right path forward. So again, it's a conversation. We're not bringing to you a draft plan today for you to comment on. This is really an open invitation to really kick off this work in the plan that is so critical around those future choices. So let me just go to the next slide if I could, and I want to acknowledge Dear Bokanon from the planning staff, the Vancouver Plan team, who's going to be advancing slides for me. This is what a lot of people think about when they think of a city plan, when they imagine in their mind's eye, what is a city plan? This is actually Vancouver's plan from 1928, done by a fellow named Harlan Bartholomew, who worked with civic leaders at the time to advance this. It was actually never formally adopted by the city council of the day. Nonetheless, it's had a very formative effect on the city's form and development. But as you can see, you know, and in planning schools and urban studies curricula today, they would say, oh, that's nice. It's kind of an old-fashioned idea here. We've got a street layout that has some hierarchies of streets. It shows lands reserved for industry, and then a concentration of commercial activity and some residential zones. What's not explicit in this kind of plan is that all the things that we care about today are only kind of, you have to squint your eyes and infer what this actually means to things that are of great concern around the affordability of housing, the access to neighborhoods. But underneath this, not explicit, was redlining of residential zones that prohibited on a racial basis or determined on a racial basis who could own homes in what parts of the city and so forth. So there's a lot about an old plan that is not, while this at least integrated an idea of transportation and land use, it's really not kind of the plan we're here to update. We're here to ask a set of more deep and profound questions and then begin to formulate ideas, whether those are policy ideas, whether those are spatial plan ideas, whether those are where we put our money ideas and so forth. So if we go to the next slide, this is actually where we are right now. On the upper left are the actual survey numbers we did in the last phase of the planning work, and just ask people straight up. And we talked to people from all corners of the community, all age groups, racial groups, marginalized groups, traditional neighborhood folks, a whole range of people, 10,000 or so responded. And when we just asked them how their life in Vancouver was, a full 55% said their life is getting worse. 30% about the same, and only 15% were optimistic, felt it was getting better. And this alongside this wonderful art piece on False Creek South, asking this question, should I be worried? I think most people would answer it yes, and there may be different reasons or sources for that worry. But this is actually the starting point, which has caused us to think about the real opportunity here is not just to do a newfangled land use plan, but really to plumb the conversation, the depths of what are people worried about and how do we address those things in a city strategy moving forward. Of course, a land use plan will be one of the products in the end of this, but it really should start here for us to kind of look into our souls and to make some choices about the future, just as we often do in our personal lives. There's that moment that comes as a young adult perhaps, or in middle age, that says, what choices am I making for myself here, and how do I activate those choices so I can be who I am and who I want to be? If you think about that in a collective sense, that's the question we're asking in this invitation to you to help move that conversation forward. So if we could go to the next slide, dear. We have augmented a lot of that work, and it has been documented by those surveys and conversations and touch points with the community about their hopes and fears and concerns. We've augmented that with some sort of evidence-based work here on scanning the horizon for trends that will affect our choices, but not determine them. A lot of these are global trends that manifest locally. Some are very localized trends and so forth, and then posited some potential futures if we play those trends out and did nothing, a sort of a base case business as usual. And so that work is underway and will inform the community dialogues and council decisions going forward. So we've done both a sort of a normative, if you will, approach by asking people about their values and their concerns. And we're also doing a kind of scientific approach of looking at the data, and those will be married up in the coming phase. Next slide, please. And I think, you know, there are some examples around the world. Let me just talk about a couple that aren't on this screen that have at least informed my thinking over the years. About cities that took kind of that deep look. There were a couple of capitals in Europe that were sort of, they were wonderful capital cities 2 to 3 to 4 centuries ago, Amsterdam being one, Copenhagen being another, that found themselves in crisis, frankly, in the late 20th century and had to look into their soul and say, who are we and what do we want to be? And the very short course of that is that Copenhagen and Denmark as a whole doubled down on a complete pivot in energy, which turned their economy around and then sprung all kinds of attendant benefits in terms of not only transportation and urban living, but also in terms of investment in higher education. And Amsterdam, in a way, did something similar by deciding they'd invert their traditional history of being the world traders and ask the world to come to them by building essentially conference facilities, an enlarged airport, so forth and so on. They became a major center for commerce and trade of ideas as well as goods in the modern era. In Curitiba in Brazil, another one which said, you know, we've got huge poverty and yet that poverty, those people in poverty are our greatest resource. So what if we turn all of our city building efforts into employing those folks in various creative ways to help build the city? And that's another interesting case. We've also looked more recently at more current examples that you can see on the screen here, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but for example, in the upper left is the city of Edmonton's very recent plan, where they've said, you know, we're not going to try to guess exactly how much we're going to grow by population or by jobs, but why don't we commit ourselves to a dual purpose here of designing a city that is comfortable for us and sustainable and works for us, that would be 2 million people instead of the 1 million that's there now, without further expanding our urban growth area. And so that's the sort of purpose they took on there. If you look at the lower left, it's from Stockholm. Stockholm settled on 4 key overarching goals and really landed those in many ways, in both in terms of a spatial organizing plan, but and also the neighborhood livability piece, and doing it in terms of investment priority and so forth and so on. So a very strategic plan in a way. And then Auckland, New Zealand, which is on its kind of refresh of their 2050 plan now, really went deep into much of what Gabe George was talking about at the beginning of engaging their native Maori culture and excavating timeless design principles to really inform their work there in terms of how they would organize city social, economic, and physical development going forward. So there's some interesting precedents out there, and I think these give us a window into some possibilities for Vancouver, but I would just have to say, the great thing is we get to invent our own, and it really should suit our purposes. Next slide, please. So we have said from the outset here that we want our plan to at least have these core elements to it. An integrated and strategic policy framework along the lines I was describing some examples of. We do want to have a spatial plan or structure plan, like where would growth go, what needs to serve it, get over the notion of sort of the haunting of city council meetings of spot rezonings, but to actually have a more transparent and rational plan about where and what kind of growth we have, including in neighborhoods. We do want to sort of sharpen our public investment strategy so it aligns with the long-term choices that we want to make, whether those are in social programs, whether they are in hard infrastructure, or whatever the city's budget will do. If we skip over to the partnerships piece, it's also a time for us to look at, is the city the only actor here in determining and manifesting, implementing this future vision? Or do we have regional partners? Do we have community partners, civic groups, nonprofits, all on board to do their part as well? And what is our relationship to federal and provincial resources to fill gaps? And what specifically are those? Can we be more clear in our advocacy for higher levels of senior funding to fund those long-term gaps that we see? And then number 4, how will we measure our progress toward the kind of future we want to have? And then finally, particularly with COVID, the notion of having short-term recovery actions or action while planning, quick wins as we go along through this next 2 years or more is also really important to demonstrate publicly what we mean by the evolution of these emerging choices and directions, and also begin to assist with the economic and social recovery that's been accentuated by the pandemic. So we have that sort of overall notion, but I wanted to come back to the sort of central 3-part challenge that I see in particular here. One is, as we've articulated already, going deep into our needs, our desires, and then using our imagination. So that's one piece. The second piece is making sure that we are enfranchising all to participate in this effort and to take the notion of co-creation as far as we can, which means listening to all voices, including and even perhaps especially voices that have not been robustly represented in the civic dialogue today. So as I mentioned, we've made particular efforts to reach out to First Nations, to Indigenous populations, to immigrant populations, to youth, and to elderly, to make sure that this effort not only represents their interests, but includes them and their voices and their ideas in shaping them. And the third piece I would say is part of the fundamental challenge here is thinking about this not as a fixed document that's produced in 2 years and then refined in with implementation policies in 2 more years, but that it's actually a living plan. And for that, we really need this to be broadly, not just broadly understood amongst the community, but broadly participated in, both by contributing partner organizations, but also by the public in general, so that if you go back to that "should I be worried" sign there we saw on the waterfront, and I've asked this question over the years, and I never get a positive answer, which is, do you have a sense of where Vancouver is going and wants to go? And people cannot answer that question. We need to have in the public's eye both an embedded idea of a central vision, but also an idea about how they can participate going forward to shape that future. So I would say, if next slide, we do have emerging some, as Meg and Andy alluded to, we have some kind of focal points for discussion, and some of these will be represented in future panel discussions here in this series. And by the way, we have several streams of participation, engagement, dialogue outside of this this SFU panel series, which is great. But I would say 5 of those are really central to landing a good plan here. One is just the notion of reshaping our neighborhoods so that the neighborhoods throughout Vancouver, regardless of their location and scale, are doing their part for not just accommodating expected growth, but also by responding to the climate changes that we know are happening in our climate emergency plan, which has just been adopted, that they are enhancing livability, walkability, a mix of uses in the neighborhood, but that they're also addressing as well inclusiveness and affordability, so that these are neighborhoods for all people and so forth. And there are lots of things that come alongside of that around improving green, improving transportation options and so forth. So that neighborhoods focus is one, and that's where, frankly, a lot of the magic will happen. A second one I would posit is living with nature in harmony. I would say is the larger wrapper, but this goes to really accelerating our programs around climate change and other aspects of sustainability, but it also goes to recognizing we live on the land and next to the water, and we need to reintroduce those systems into the urban environment in a functional way. And also to be resilient in terms of, this pandemic, as we will discover on the panel discussion here, and you will in your small groups, has really opened up our eyes to so many cracks in the system. And it really has told us we're not a very resilient city. We responded quickly. We've done reasonably well, as has the province in general. But this is the first of many shock waves that could hit us, whether those are around disease, whether those are around earthquakes and so forth and so on. So that piece of sort of living with nature, as I broadly described it, as a second one. A third one is really dialing in and focusing on the economy, and really understanding where our economy could go to be more diverse and robust, but also to serve a notion of shared prosperity, a kind of purpose-built economy, if you will, that obviously the private sector and its infusion of capital and its innovation will lead a lot of, but the public and the city are critical partners in making sure that that economy is both diverse and serving a diverse population. So that's the third one. The fourth in my mind is how we open today's session with really centering real dialogues around reconciliation, decolonization, and equity, more broadly speaking. We're not going to figure that all out in 18 months. What we can do is commit to the centering of that, infusing that in all the other parts of the plan, but also in provoking a much more robust and centered conversation of a set of dialogues going forward in the future, so that our nascent efforts here around reconciliation can actually be realized. And rather than prescribe those outcomes, I think that the notion here to really start that process of learning, of walking forward together, is an essential piece of what we'd like to highlight and foster through the plan. And finally, there's a part of this about how we, as a city at least, and perhaps others, revisiting how we do business and even how we make decisions as a community. And there are many aspects here that can get talked about, everything from expanding the municipal toolkit of resources to address pressing needs like the opioid crisis and shortcomings in infrastructure, a whole range of things, our relationship with senior governments, but also things like neighborhood-based budgeting, looking at ways to finance our capital needs for infrastructure and so forth, and for growth without a dependency on large strata towers that will throw off a certain amount of revenue, and then we hope that will fill the gap. Looking at our regional relationships with other cities and with Metro, and even looking toward Cascadia as an economic region. So the notion about how we do business, how we engage you and make clear what is happening with you, I think is a very high interest to council, and another piece that needs to get wrapped into the plan. I know I can see Meg, I'm going over my time here, yeah. So I'll wrap right up. Just to the next slide or two are just the provisional goals, which Meg already showed on screen in the poll. So I won't go over these, but they're there. Again, they're on the website. I think there are 2 slides of these. So these are the first 5, the second 5. And really these just serve as, if you will, guidance. They're not ends in themselves exactly as plan statements, but they are guidance for developing of choices and policies going forward. They do represent the core aspirations we heard from the community, and the council reflected those in this provisional statement of goals. Final slide, I think, coming up. Just where we are in the process, we're really in this 2021 period coming up, phase 2 and phase 3. So that's the work ahead of us. And the beginning of that conversation is really right here this afternoon. And so we welcome your ongoing participation and engagement as we move forward.
Thanks very much, Gil. That was a little bit longer than we had envisioned, but it was all very important information. And I think we all appreciate the you laying out both the steps that the city is taking and has taken, as well as your sort of stance towards doing something different with this plan. But not to sacrifice our time to go far into the diverse voices that we have assembled here today. What I'm going to propose is that we are going to extend the panel 15 minutes. So that means that we are going to extend this panel discussion until 4:30. So please, and apologies for those who may have to leave, but we are going to then go into the breakout rooms at 4:30 rather than 4:15. And I'm also going to we're going to ask Gil, because you've kind of cheated a little bit in providing some of the answers that you might have given to the panel question in your presentation. We're going to ask you to take a bit of a pass on the panel, at least the initial round. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So over to Andy to introduce our panelists.
Oh, thank you, Meg. And I'm joined here today by a great panel of urbanists and folks who I think work and love cities, and really they're here today to really, I think, provide a comment upon really moving the conversation and a series of questions that will be, I think, posed towards this question of what planning in the post-pandemic city might look like. We're joined by Ginger Gosnell Myers, by Adriana Laurent, as well as Lisa Karavica, and that we are their biographies can be seen in the chat. That I'll for time's sake I won't read out their biographies, but that I think the panelists are joining us now. That this is, I think, an opportunity for the panelists we'll have 3 minutes to answer a question, and the others will have 1 minute or 30 seconds, preferably 30 seconds, to respond. So I think we are ready to go. And I think that we'll begin, I think, with Ginger, and Ginger is as the Indigenous Fellow at the SFU Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue. And the question I think we have for all our panelists to, I think, provide comment on is really how the last 8 months have busted a lot of trusted truths we thought that we could rely on about the nature of the emergency of COVID-19, what makes our city work, what makes our city livable, how we play and socialize safely, and what we can and should do together. What have you learned and experienced about Vancouver in the past 8 months that you would not have guessed before? Ginger.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Hi. I've been thinking a lot about this question because there's so much that could be said, but I've narrowed it down to 3 things. One is how, I don't want to say pleased, but I am happy that we're finally talking about the reality of systemic racism, and how this systemic racism is at the root of it is this concept that we haven't talked about, which is white supremacy, and how this has really led to a lot of the inequities that we are facing in our cities today. And we're creating space within our dialogues to think really critically about both inequities, white supremacy, systemic racism, and allowing ourselves to be, I think, a lot more honest than we have in the past about how it's impacted our current state. and how it's gotten us to where we are today. And when you think about a lot of the realities that we're learning around Black Lives Matter, defund the police, decolonization, and how these were fringe issues before, they're not fringe issues anymore. And in fact, we're expecting our decision makers and our leaders to have answers to how they're both addressing this and combating it. And it kind of aligns with, the other two things that I've noticed. One is that, COVID has taught us that we really need our neighborhoods. We desperately need a closer connection to our communities. And when you look at a lot of the communities that we've lost since, the beginning of colonization in Vancouver, we've lost Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh communities. We've really pushed Indigenous peoples out, as Gabe talked to us in the opening about. But we've also lost our Black community. We've lost Hogan's Alley. We've lost, the Punjabi market. We've seen the erasure of Chinatown. And we've been talking about this in terms of gentrification. There's actually a systemic racial injustice to how some neighborhoods are protected while others are allowed to disappear. We've even seen, the character of Commercial Drive or Little Italy begin to erode over time. And only recently that, history and that identity is being protected. And the final thing that has been really clear is that we shouldn't expect our governments to just listen, and we kind of heard that early on in Gil's presentation, how, there's a longer period of listening. We know that listening is not enough, and we've seen our governments able to take action, and not just action, but invest. And without this action and investment, we would definitely all be struggling much more than we are today. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ginger. The next panelist I'd like to invite is Adriana Laurent. And Adriana, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like it's always so hard to follow Ginger. She always has so much amazing things to say. But I want to start by saying thank you for being invited to participate, and thank you for organizing this event, and thank you to all the speakers and the folks who are joining us today. For today, I'll also be speaking from my own perspective and will not be representing any organization or institution I'm involved with. But in terms of answering the question, the last 8 months, I think, have been a really difficult moment of reckoning for a lot of people. We've had to face head on the deeply rooted systems of oppression that we are dealing with. And marginalized communities have also known this for a very long time. So that comes to no surprise to us. For many, the last 8 months have only highlighted what we already know, that our institutions and systems are profoundly unjust. And when I think about this, there's a particular quote that comes to mind. I can't remember who said this quote, but white supremacy isn't the shark, it's the water. It's everywhere. It's embedded within all of our institutions and all of our systems. And to echo what Ginger said, we're really at a place where we are finally able to confront this and finally able to deal with it. And something that I've also learned is just how interconnected these multiple crises are, and how we're dealing with many of them at the same time, whether we're talking about the pandemic, whether we're talking about the housing crisis, the climate crisis, the overdose crisis, the racial justice crisis. What I've learned from this is that we need to ensure that we're constantly working towards protecting folks who have been most marginalized, so that when a crisis hits or when there's a lot of uncertainty, we have the social infrastructure to protect our communities. And some of these crises are not so distant in the future. For example, there's something I always talk about, the climate crisis is not some faraway issue that we'll have to deal with 20 years from now. It's something that is happening right now. And I know that we're focusing on Vancouver, but I do want to kind of take a note from Gil's book and learn from other places around the world. For example, my home country in Honduras is currently struggling with COVID-19. On top of that, we got hit by a Category 4 hurricane on November 4th. And just when we thought it couldn't get worse, we got hit by a Category 5 hurricane 2 weeks later. Cities like Vancouver may not be feeling the most devastating impacts of climate change just yet, but we are at risk too. And we need to start thinking and working now to ensure that our city is resilient at the face of the climate crisis, and that we're protecting the most marginalized communities with all the work that we're doing. And another thing that I've learned in the last couple of months is that our resilience when facing these intersecting crises actually comes from being able to show up for each other. It comes from, we've also seen that change is not just necessary, but it's also possible. We're learning to navigate through this uncertainty as a collective. And I think we need to realize that we're headed towards more uncertainty as well. And I've learned that above all, the biggest lesson for me in the last 8 months has been that we need to protect and value our people. We need to protect and value our land and our water. And we need to value our most vulnerable communities if we want to have a livable, affordable, and just city.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adriana. I guess the next panelist is Lisa Karavica. And Lisa is the program director over at the Canadian Urban Institute based in Toronto. And over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, it's really hard to go after Ginger and Adriana. I don't want to repeat what they've said, but I totally agree with everything that they say, so I'm not going to repeat, but I'll just make a couple of other points. So actually, first of all, I'm coming in from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat people. In the work that we're doing, we're looking at what's happening in cities around the world in COVID. And so there are things that are surprising and there are things that are kind of not surprising. And like Adriana and Ginger said, there have been groups of people screaming about inequity for the longest time. And it's only now that there has been, people are listening, or at least some people are listening, and there seems to be an appetite for doing something about it, which is great amid this tragedy that we're in. Inequity and the problems that we're seeing in our cities, including Vancouver, are very spatially impacted. And so what has been kind of surprising with this pandemic for me is that because we have this stay home order, or trying to stay as close to home as possible, it is actually possible to not be interacting with the kinds of people that you would normally interact with if you were able to go about your business. And so I live in a very nice neighborhood in the city of Toronto. And so if I was just going to stay at home, I've got a lovely main street, I've got lovely green space near me, and I could think that all is right in the world if I don't think beyond those, that geography of where I live. So that's something that we have to watch for. I think what has been very surprising to me and I've been delighted with is how nimble our municipal governments have been, and all of our federal government as well, some provincial governments, and our people have been pretty nimble. And so it shows us that when we want to get stuff done, we actually can. And so I want to keep pushing on that. I've worked in many cities around the world. I did a lot of work in the Philippines and have worked in communities that have suffered from devastating disasters, oil spills, flooding, major typhoons. In every city in the world, of course, there's been something. In Toronto, we've had flooding, and Calgary, there have been fires and floods. And the communities that are most resilient are the ones that are highly connected to their neighborhoods and have that transparency and accountability with their local government. Someone in the chat asked a question like, why do we need plans? And I think that why do we need a plan at this time? And I think it's so important actually now that we have plans, because we need to be really deliberate about dealing with these enormous systemic issues that we're talking about. That's all I'll say now.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. And actually, I think we might, if Gil is with us, I was hoping to kind of get his kind of thoughts and reactions to, I think, some of the comments that were given by the panel. Over to you, Gil.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I'm happy to, and I'll keep it brief this time. I really take to heart of what all the panelists have said here, and was really the theme for tonight. And we'll be getting into other aspects of the plan in the future segments of this series. But as one speaker noted, maybe it was Meg at the beginning, we've posited reconciliation, resilience, and equity as really foundational principles that, and sort of cross-cutting themes that will run through the entire planning work. And so the notion that it's not just some note-taking and writing down of feel-good policies, but that it's actually a matter of some of the exploring the deeper dimensions that these panelists have talked about is exactly right. And one of the reasons I kind of posited that as a fifth central piece of the dialogue and outcome. I think the pandemic, Andy, has actually exposed those deeper fissures in the community, and I think several of the panelists alluded to that are long-term injustices. We've seen how the pandemic affected different groups differently. That has been a lesson, and in many ways, the pandemic has also caused the population at large to think about questions like, what is it that I really need in my life? And how do I want to live? And what do I want most for my kids? And so I think these are really fundamental questions that should shape it. And I think the notion that we've tried to advance today and so far in the listening, which is not opposed to taking action, but the listening is critical, is to actually make that broad invitation to participate in the co-creation of this. And so I just wanted to come back to that invitation that everything I heard today was important and right in line, and including listening to voices of dissent, and not just listening, but actually surfacing and empowering those voices. That's what's going to shape a new kind of plan here. So I really appreciate what the other panelists have said. And I think both our planning and our actions along the way will hopefully begin to reflect those voices and deeper challenges. So we know there are lots of other challenges coming through both the pandemic and the recession in terms of how people will live and work in the future, and how they view the streets in their neighborhood as being for people, not just for cars. And there are all kinds of things that are really coming out as kind of bright light lessons around this this pandemic has served up for Vancouver, that allows us to kind of hold a mirror up and say, we could make some real systemic changes here. And we kind of know what some of those are already. So I'll hold it there, Andy. Thank you.
Can I jump in here, Andy? And just, I want to push Gil a little bit on, because I'm not sure that, I mean, what I heard, especially from the brief comments from Ginger and Adriana, is that we're not talking about systemic racism. And what I see also happening in the chat, just generally, are a lot of concerns about increasing segregation by wealth and segregation by race in the city. And I wonder if you can comment just briefly on how a land use plan attempts to address that, or how it could.
Well, first of all, it's not a land use plan only. And secondly, I saw all those comments in the chats, and I think they are reflections of what has been happening in Vancouver over the decades. And really one of the reasons for showing that Bartholomew plan is if you only do a land use plan, you avoid deeper questions like the one that you just acknowledged there, Meg. And so, you know, in our own core planning staff, it's now about 43%, I think, non-white. And so, and we've made extraordinary efforts to reach deeper into the community for voices that have been heretofore marginalized. And so rather than me as a chief planner prescribing what the results of our planning should be, I think we really do want to engage people about what is the possible future here that begins to heal those wounds, including the segregation by income. As I mentioned, part of the aspiration in that complete neighborhoods work is really to make those neighborhoods inclusive. And that may mean challenging our current model of land economics and housing finance and so forth. So it's the what do we really want first, and then what are the means by which we need to employ to make those changes actually stick on the ground, whether those are in finance or infrastructure investment, or whether they're in housing models, or whatever it happens to be. So so I would just say yes to what we heard.
Thank you, Gil. And actually, I guess I'm gonna pass it over to Meg for the next series, next question for our panelists.
Okay, I mean, so yeah, well, I would like to hear maybe a little bit more. Gil has raised some ideas about some kind of strategic, structural, as well as investment kinds of decisions that the city can make, and design-based decisions and other kinds of things. But the profession of planning and this sort of the apparatus that we've built, but that we expect to guide the city in a strategic way. I want to know from the panelists if you think it is fit to do the job of long-term planning for the City of Vancouver for the next 30 years. Ginger? Or how it could be fit, maybe, to put the question in a more constructive way.
I mean, our cities are definitely fit to respond to long-term planning, and they should, but we can't ignore the importance of being nimble and being flexible at the same time. We wouldn't want to lock ourselves into a long-term plan that doesn't allow us, you know, the ability to like veer off the path when we learn, you know, new issues or have new solutions to offer. You know, when we were, you know, talking about, you know, building this panel early on, you know, one of the things that we discussed was around the learnings. And, you know, the city has these provisional goals within the Vancouver Plan. I think they're strong goals. You know, they definitely reflect what we should be striving towards. But, you know, when we look at the difference between a strong vision and carrying out action, it is that capacity. And so, you know, one of the things that we've learned are that there are deep inequities, and that these inequities have driven how decisions have been made in the past, and we're suffering with those consequences today. We can't fix these issues. We can't bring in the type of innovation or creativity that we want if we don't see, you know, senior leadership, decision makers at City Hall reflect the makeup of the population that we have. And one of the comments that we did see is that, you know, the decision makers in City Hall are pretty monocultural. You know, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. You know, we know that experience and lived experience matters, and that, you know, not having people that have that kind of expertise, that lens, that deep connection to why these inequities exist, how they feel, you know, what it feels like to be given an opportunity to step away from them and be provided an opportunity for a better life. These are things that the Vancouver Plan can address. These are one of the other big learnings that I think we're talking about today, is that cities have a remarkable power to respond to community needs, to respond to climate change, to respond to racism, you know, through the built form, through land use planning, through, you know, a lot of other aspects that I think we probably just didn't think about before. But our ability to respond to all of these things that we're learning about right now will be hampered if we don't see Indigenous people in leadership positions, Black people in leadership positions, young people in leadership positions, people with disabilities in leadership positions. All of these lenses and experience matter. We know this. The exclusion is real, and we know that investment helps. COVID has taught us that as well. Investment matters.
Thanks. Adriana?
Yes, once again, always super hard to follow, Ginger, but I'll try to do my best. So I do want to echo what she said. I think we need to have systems and ways of operating through our city that are flexible and adaptable to change. And we've seen that this is possible. And I know that's something that other folks like Lisa also mentioned. But to kind of address the issue of like planning as a profession, I think that the issue isn't just planning. I think it's the entire system that we're operating in, and the planning profession is just a reflection of that. And to kind of answer that question, I'll kind of try to take two approaches to answering this, both within the planning profession and outside of it. And just to be completely clear, I am not an urban planner, so that shapes my view on this. But within the urban planning profession, I'll be very blunt. Urban planning is a profession that's very known for being very white and very male dominated. And of course, I think we need a lot more diversity in that. But I also want to be really clear. Having more diversity will not automatically mean that we'll shift towards radical transformational change. We need community leaders who are in decision-making positions who will move us towards radical change. And these decision makers also need to be grounded in serving and supporting communities, especially the most marginalized communities who have been historically and presently marginalized. And a couple questions that like always come to mind for me when I think about urban planning or city plans is like, who are we planning the city for? Whose safety is prioritized and why? How are we even defining safety? Who defines it to begin with? Who has a seat at the table but doesn't have any power in decision making? How are we planning while centering the stolen lands we're on? And I think these are huge, massive questions that I don't think that urban planners can or should come up with answers on their own. That wouldn't be fair to them either. And I think that planning for our collective future must reflect the diversity of experiences navigating the city, because we don't live through the same experiences as COVID has painfully shown us. And from outside of the planning profession, being an urban planner also requires you to have an academic background. And I think I also want to recognize my own privilege as someone who works and goes to an academic institution. But that being said, I will be super blunt again. I don't think the ivory tower alone will move us towards a decolonial and just and climate resilient future. I don't think that that's the case. Academic institutions can be very exclusive spaces. They're inaccessible for many lower income folks, for disabled folks, there's a lot of classism and racism deeply embedded within them. And I have learned that knowledge exists outside of academia. Planning happens outside of academia as well, and outside of the planning department. And we need to learn to value this knowledge and these experiences to a much, much higher degree if we want to actually navigate these overlapping crises. You shouldn't need a master's degree to have a say in the future that you live in, the city that you live in. And we need to be able to co-create this within our own city. And that's kind of echoing what the panelists said and what Gail said as well. And of course, we need to have research for our work and for the planning of our cities. And there's been a lot of really good work. Like, I'm not trying to critique that entirely, but planning for our future can't be seen as a silver bullet that's coming from research or from urban planners or from city council. To me, it comes from all of us. The people impacted by these crises need to be at the center of decision-making from start to finish. And if I could get folks to remember one thing that I said, because I know I'm probably going a little bit over time right now, but if I can get folks to remember one thing from what I'm saying today, is that we need to center justice in the process as well as the outcome of our planning. We can't miraculously arrive at a justice-centered plan or a justice-centered policy if we're not centering justice in the process and the creation of this work. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Adriana. Lisa, what are your thoughts on this question? And in particular, I'm just noticing that Maya Corbin asked a question that I think you're really suited to answer about the kinds of adaptive planning techniques and strategies that could be usefully incorporated into a new kind of plan with new expertise and new processes.
Yeah, sure. So I am an urban planner, and so so I think a plan that is flexible and is a framework for decision making, and there are lots of tools around that have been experimented with in other places. Right now, the city of Edmonton is, they've just launched their plan, which Gil pointed out, but they're now working on a new zoning bylaw that has a gender-based analysis plus lens to it. So centering that justice and equity in how they do zoning. And then there are other people around the country that are doing work on form-based codes and other kind of planning technical stuff that allows for flexibility and really, I think that's what it is. It's a framework of decision-making based on the values that you've set out in the plan. I want to build on something that Adriana said, if you don't mind, that it's not just about the numbers. It's not just enough to hire more planners in the city. It's also about providing them the opportunity and the space to change the system and to be heard, and to promote them, and to give them the right the benefits of being in a system to work in. And then while and it's not just racialized people that we need in planning, we also need racialized Canadians and non-racialized Canadians who have that lived experience. And while we're waiting for those people to be promoted and change the system, we also need to do two other things that are important. Ensure that we vote in politicians who also reflect our community, and that includes changing the system that favors incumbents by looking at ranked ballots and other kind of political processes. And we also need to build capacity and work through our community organizations who can speak to and elevate lived experience to guide the growth and development of our communities. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Lisa. One thing that we haven't talked too much about yet on this panel, but that has really come into focus, of course, through the COVID pandemic, and I'm also seeing come up quite a bit in the chat window, is the reality of an aging population and the particular needs and the particular importance of planning for our seniors and an aging demographic. And in particular, Anthony Cooper-Schmidt asks, has the City of Vancouver put enough emphasis on population aging in approaching the Vancouver Plan? Demographic changes do not seem to have had a lot of consideration, but this is essential for future planning. Does anybody want to start with that one? And it doesn't have to be specific, obviously, to the Vancouver Plan, but how do we address that? How do we address aging populations in our planning today? Sure, go ahead.
I think one of the things that we can do is permeate into our established neighborhoods and allow more flexibility in the types of housing that are in, and to allow more mid-rise and more flexible housing that are in our established communities. Gil Peñalosa often says that the best cities are ones that are designed for 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds, and then they make it happy and good for everything in between. The way that our suburbs and our cities are so polarized with single-family homes versus high-rise towers is not the way to do it. And the unaffordability of our cities are why our cities are so, why cities like Vancouver are aging, have that population pyramid where there are so many older folks, because younger folks cannot afford to live in the city.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on that question? If not, we can turn to, we've kind of talked about that one. What is it? So Morgan McDonald asks, what is it about this discussion that is specifically post-pandemic? What have we learned about value, risk, priorities, community, etc., that will inform our thinking?
Yeah, I've seen that question come up as well. It's a good one. And it's good because, we see governments responding in a very nimble manner. We're able to, I think, push aside issues and projects that perhaps take up too much time and not allow us to focus on what really matters to people. I think even the question around how to support seniors through planning and in our cities really ties into this, because what we need to focus on for the future are the sense of community, understanding who we are, what we value, how we can come together, and our focus on city building up to this point has really been through the projects that developers and through I think private folks have been forwarding. And it's really taken away the voice of folks that really work, volunteer, connect, and try to have a sense of belonging. All of these aspects have really fallen to the wayside. We know that they're incredibly valued, more so than we probably afforded them in the past. And this is tied to a lot of the discussion around inequity that we have been touching upon to this point. There are things that we value that we just don't talk about enough. And this is affording us this opportunity to dream and to create some aspirations for our city where before we hadn't.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ginger. I think at this point, I'll open it up to the panel to see, before we break into our breakout rooms, that if there's any more kind of comments, responses that folks on the panel would like to make on some of the questions that have been posed, as well as perhaps comments from their fellow panelists.
I actually just want to quickly follow up on what Ginger said. And I think something that I've seen that I didn't mention before, but something that I've also seen in the last couple of months or in the last year or so, is that we've been able to radically imagine a different world where we didn't think it was possible before. Like, we've seen huge shifts. We've seen governments on a provincial, on a federal level, et cetera, be adaptable and be nimble. And we've seen that the community is ready for change. We are seeing that there's a lot of people who are struggling right now, and we're able to face these issues head on. And I think that has put us in a position that I would say we weren't previously in, where we're able to actually expand our imagination for what we want the future to look like, and are actually having conversations that aren't limited to what we think is possible, but are actually open to what is necessary. So I think that point to me is something that I think, like, as a society, maybe as a city, we're closer to being at that point where we're able to collectively reimagine the future that we want, the city that we want, that really places those values that we've learned through the pandemic. So I think that to me is a key point as to why this conversation is post-COVID, is because we are now open to thinking about things in a radically different way. And we're not being shut down immediately. We're talking about things that were previously, taboo or just weren't brought up or were shut down immediately. But now we're actually open to these. And again, like I said, we are in a place where we are able to, all of us, radically reimagine a different world. And I think that puts us in a very good position for the future.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jana. Lisa?
20 seconds. I ran across this quote today, and I just thought I would share it. And it's from his name is Ron Harris, Minneapolis's Chief Resilience Officer. And he said, "You can't benefit from green buildings if your city is plagued by racial inequity and racism." And so I think that's something we need to always keep in mind, that nothing really matters unless equity and justice are at the center of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right.
Andy, if I could just touch on one point that I really liked what Adriana just said a moment ago, which I actually think this COVID moment has really opened our eyes and has given us the ability to both dig deep and to imagine and reimagine not only the future for Vancouver, but also the way in which we do planning and we do city building. And so I think that's on the table. I just want to make that clear, because I heard in Meg's voice from skepticism around that. That's really on the table. And that's what I was trying to say with those three principles around And I do agree with Lisa that in the end, what this is a decision-making framework that is much more enabling of not only the nimbleness that Ginger talked about, but actually continuing to hew to those main aspirations and goals that the community at large is articulating through this process. So just wanted to really echo Adriana's kind of a focus on this moment and the huge opportunity that it affords. And I believe the city councilors who are here today also believe that this is their moment to usher in kind of a new era of both decision making and of kind of getting right to the heart of the matter and enabling all the city systems to enable that going forward into the future. So thanks for letting me close with that.
Thanks very much. And thanks to all of our panelists. Let's give them a little Zoom round of applause, shall we? Now, with all of that energy, all of those great, radical, constructive, as well as sobering reminders and thoughts, we are going to head into our breakout rooms. And so this is really the chance to start the discussion. And I've been really impressed by the questions that have been raised as well in the chat. So I know that not just the panelists, but also the participants today are bursting at the seams with ideas. So a few things about the breakout rooms. There are going to be, you will be placed into, you'll be prompted to join a breakout room on your screen. Each breakout room will have a facilitator, so somebody to pose these questions that you see on your screen now to you. There will also be a note taker, and the purpose of that is that these notes will be taken back by the city staff and they will be compiled and they will be used going forward in the process. And there will be a key city staff member or counselor who will be there to listen and to learn, and then they will have the opportunity to report back one key idea that comes up in your breakout room. We won't be recording those breakout sessions, and I forgot to mention that we have been recording this main room session, but that the video only focuses on the speakers. So you don't have to worry about being recorded in the breakout room conversations. If you have been using the closed captioning or the ASL, please do not go into the breakout rooms because those two technologies aren't available in the breakout rooms. But you can stay in the main session. And just, keep in mind the community guidelines, obviously. And we will see you back here for those who are able to stick with us, although we are going about 15 minutes over. We will see you back here in 25 minutes, yes, and there will be that report back from all of the breakout rooms and a few words about where we hope to go with the next phases of this process and then where the city's going with the next phases of its process. Okay. I think we are ready to go into the breakout rooms.
I'll give you guys a sec there. Okay. Hopefully everybody kind of just turned off their screens there. And we're now really entering the phase of our report backs from our respective breakout rooms. And that this is really meant to be a rapid fire report back. And the question, and I will be calling the respective, city staff listeners in here to report out that the question we are going to ask is what was the most resonant from the breakout room conversation for you today? It could be a pattern, it could be a similar theme, it could be a particular comment, etc. We will keep these comments to 30 seconds or a minute, and we'll be calling them according to room number order, and your timing will be kept in sync because I will start beatboxing should you overtake that time. And you do not want to hear me beatboxing.
No, you do not.
You do not. So you have been warned. So we shall begin, beginning with the main room, breakout room 1, where it's the listeners was Tanya Oswald.
Hi, I'm not sure if Karis wants to jump in, but I can say a few words. thank you for everyone that was in the main meeting room and hanging out. We talked about public space. We talked about grassroots planning initiatives. We talked about mental health and the need for planning to incorporate that. And also for planning to be inclusive of everybody and how we can do that better. So thank you. And we also talked about the city's pilot programs during COVID. Thanks.
Thank you so much. The next person is Councillor Christine Boyle. Councillor Boyle.
Thanks. So I'll be brief too. Of course, we covered a number of topics. We heard about the unbearable whiteness of some neighborhoods in Vancouver and the voices that we've seen in neighborhoods but don't see in decision making. We heard about the need for better options for intergenerational living and the many different ways that that looks for people, and also related to that, the need for more housing options all throughout neighborhoods, not just on our arterials, as generations figure out what their lives look like and what our neighborhoods look like down the road.
Thank you, Councillor Boyle. The next person to report out is Councillor Sarah Kirby-Young. Councillor Kirby-Young.
Thanks, Andy. I feel like I'm on The Price is Right. Come on down. No, our group had a great discussion, and there was a real coalescence around the importance of neighborhoods and how much neighborhoods matter, and that we can really focus on how we create those in terms of creating connections and celebrating our differences, bringing people together, the critical importance of community amenities like libraries and community centers that they play. A lot of emphasis on public space, the importance of more neighborhood spaces, more social spaces, automatically building green space into development, and how they connect and bring everyone together, and how that notion of the importance of connection has been exacerbated or daylighted during COVID-19, and that people had suffered more mental sort of health and isolation issues, and that we do have the ability to build healthy communities, whether that's mental health or community health and engagements, through creating community connections, whether it's community connectors or in how we build the communities and how we enable people to come together.
Great, thank you, Councillor Kirby-Young. The next is Councillor Jean Swanson. Councillor Swanson.
I can't seem to turn on my video, but that just means you don't have to look at my face, I guess. So we had two questions. One was, what have we learned about Vancouver because of COVID? And people said valuing the connection with others, becoming aware of our privilege because we can work from home, and appreciation of green space, and the acuteness of the homeless situation. And then another question was, what should be in place for a city that cares for all? And people talked a lot about how you have to reach out to everybody, and especially people with lived experience. And one suggestion was to give people a small gift card to get their opinions.
Right. Thank you, Councillor Swanson. The next person is Councillor Pete Fry. Oh, wow. Hi. Hi, Councillor Swanson.
Hey, Andy.
All right. Thank you for making your appearance. Councillor Fry. There we go.
I'll keep it quick because we have public hearing tonight too. So I know we've got to squeeze in some dinner and that kind of thing. So we certainly heard, I think echoing what some others have mentioned about the lack of diversity and opportunities for racialized folks at the leadership table, and how can we change that? In considering some of how we plan for the future, how are we planning for young people especially, and seniors, and where are they at the table? Looking at what we learned through COVID, I think one of the interesting observations was presented that we've seen an opportunity where folks have embraced alternate forms of transportation like cycling and walking and active transportation. How do we capitalize on that? How do we actually take that opportunity and run with it? And we've seen it happen in other jurisdictions. Australia and New Zealand came to mind. And I think that there's the framing was that perhaps there's a missed opportunity there that we could better jump upon through that learning through COVID. And I think one of the other pieces was was a lack of public washrooms, which is something council's actively talking about and working on right now. But that lack of public washrooms in the COVID context, super challenging. And then concerns about sort of an increase in petty crime and that kind of thing as a result of COVID.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Fry, and thank you for a reminder of what's going on, Council. And I will now do executive privilege and call out the councillors first. Woohoo! Councillor Rebecca Bly.
Hi, Andy, and thanks so much. Hi, everybody. We had also a really great discussion, and a couple things that stood out were, first of all, around COVID and how the city changed in terms of how people moved about, and that essential workers and delivery services and things like that were not necessarily the main sort of congestion of traffic on the roads. They were still doing their work, and we saw the roads being quite empty. So maybe looking at how how sort of the existing constructs in society of when people go to work and things like that could be shifted with more flexibility around COVID. And then the cost of unaffordability and how big business is taking over some areas of the city, and small businesses are not able to survive. So really wanting to make sure that we can continue to build into complete communities by looking at how we can enable, and one comment was the 15-minute city. So you can sort of leave your door and walk anywhere in 15 minutes to get where you need to go. Let's see what else. It was quite clear that the essential workers still relied heavily on transit, and that was their only choice, and really making sure that we prioritize and recognize that that's what's happening. And then understanding who the people are in the city, and what that looks like. And then the main sort of three tenants takeaways was equitable measures and enforcement, and transparency and crisis response governance, and really being able to tell the story and broadcast what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it, so that people see themselves in the choices that are being made, so that it becomes a real community collective to realize whatever we set our path on in terms of this plan itself, and that people are feeling very much bought in and part of the process. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Councillor Bly. Councillor Adrienne Carr. Councillor Carr.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Andy. And for some reason, the host has blocked my my image. So whoever that host is,
oh, dear.
They've now prompted me to start my video, so you'll probably see me. Great. Okay, that's great. So there were a number of key points that were raised for sure. I mean, I thought it was really interesting how people recognize the serious issue around homelessness, for example, and how COVID has really brought that out, and the vulnerability of people, low-income people who may not be, they work in Vancouver, may not be able to live here because of the cost, and they have to take transit when transit goes down, how incredibly precarious their lives become. But I thought two sort of themes came out for me: the change in how public space is utilized, and a real need to focus on that in the planning that we do. And secondly, that the city should be more transparent and inclusive in our planning and our decision making. And there were two examples that were raised around that. One was the feeling that a lot focuses on downtown Vancouver, and there are a lot of neighborhoods in this city. It was specifically mentioned how South Vancouver people there feel neglected. And the second piece of that is the people themselves, and seniors, for example, who may not have the technological capability to join in the Zoom calls or whatever. We need to think in our planning about how we reach out to them, and maybe good old flyers will work.
Thank you, Councillor Carr, the analog approach. Councillor Lisa Dominato. Councillor Dominato. Come on down.
Thanks, Andy. It really feels like the Price is Right. And hi, everybody. And yeah, we had a great group. There's going to be some overlap in the themes for sure. One of the things we talked about in terms of the last 8 months observations was the critical role of our high streets and commercial areas in our city and small businesses, and how challenging the pandemic has been for the mom and pop shops, and it's something we really need to pay some special attention to as a city. We also talked about how in some ways as a city we were ill prepared for something like a pandemic. We've been planning for earthquakes and other things, and but at the same time the community stepped up. We managed to step up, and that led into a discussion around the different use of our parks and our public spaces and public realm, and how this actually brought people together, fostered social connectedness, the initiative of drinking in parks, the expansion of the patios, and how in fact it proved that regulatory red tape can be overcome, that that was sort of the silver lining, is that flexibility and creativity emerged. In terms of advice for the city, we centered around the challenge of bringing diverse perspectives together and forging consensus. Leading today can be tricky, and I think one of our members talked about the groundswell to move institutions towards a different understanding of themselves. I think that was really well articulated. The importance of bringing people to the table who don't normally have a voice, particularly young people, for instance. So looking at more informal places of connecting and engaging on city initiatives as opposed to formally in a city council meeting, which can be quite intimidating. As well as looking at how we reaching people and what are the different ways of doing that, and ensuring people who don't normally have a voice have one at the table. And also thinking about demographics. This came up earlier in the dialogue around looking at other cities and what they're doing to prepare for an aging population. So hopefully I covered most of what was discussed, but it was a great discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Dominato. I just want to make sure that our collection of councillors have been cleared. Ooh, that was poetic, because I know you folks have a meeting to attend, and I believe I have cleared all the councillors. Oh man, I am on a rush. All right, excellent. Thank you so much. And so our next reporter is Jimmy Zammer. Jimmy.
Hi, Andy. I'm reporting on behalf of a group that discussed how heartened we are by the ability to pivot in the city, as we've just heard from some of the councillors. But who are also disheartened by witnessing how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted some members of our community, especially those that are facing inequities, and how it's taken a long time, like several months, for folks to understand, like for our communities to really internalize how this pandemic has disproportionately done so. In terms of planning, we talk about the importance of including everybody, including seniors, in the planning process, and having in mind people that don't have access to open and green space, the need for that as an urgent component of a healthy city, including multifunctional space and making the most use of that space for food growing and to support the local economy.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. Lon LeClaire. Lon, you out there?
Hi there.
Hello, Lon. Come on
so
down.
I was looking after room number 7, which was a great room full of thoughtful people. We discussed the focus on neighborhood-based planning, about the idea of having shops and services within your neighborhood, a little bit of concern about how land values can create some inequity, and a bit of a renewed appreciation for the role of government in general. But I would say the key idea that kind of came from the team was really about the outdoor space, about the green space, about the space, when we get outside, the ability to socially distance, and then kind of the experience of that and what COVID showed us, but it also sort of revealed, I think, some of the issues and inequities that we have in terms of our outdoor space. And so there was the idea of the distribution across the city and the availability of outdoor space. The way the space is designed, some of it works for toddlers, but not for teenagers, but maybe not for seniors, don't feel so welcome. And so the idea of it feeling open and equitable to everyone. Also comment about like even outdoor space now that it gets wet, what about dry outdoor space, but the outdoor space that's free and dry. And so a real interest, I think, in how we view the space around us, and actually streets, of course, being a big part of that. And I hope I wasn't an influence because I'm city engineer and in control of streets, but it was definitely a theme. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lon. Amanda Gibbs.
Andy, is it wrong that I want you to beatbox?
No, that was a threat. That was not a That was not
Oh, I thought it was
zone for
an
entertainment.
exciting opportunity. No, I will just say very quickly, what we heard in our group was very much echoes a lot of what's been discussed. In fact, we heard some people also echoing the real pleasure and the opportunity to have as many outdoor spaces as we do in Vancouver, particularly in comparison to other cities. But the overarching theme that emerged from what has been highlighted through the pandemic is the challenges that have been faced by folks in the downtown east side as a result of the opioid poisoning crisis, as a result of homelessness, and also for folks experiencing a lot of displacement in their rental housing. In terms of advice, we actually had a lot of current and retired planners in our group and got some really interesting technical advice. In one case, really encouraging us to look ahead to the implementation process, to really ensure that we're looking ahead in terms of how our partnerships and our planning and metrics are going to work going forward. And then we also heard a real encouragement to not to present our information in an abstract way, to present trade-offs and real life, real sort of grounded concepts for people to engage with. And finally, a real invitation or encouragement to help people think not only about their own neighborhoods and backyard, but to think regionally and to think about the effort and the opportunities across our city and across our region.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Neil Wells.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, folks. Lots of similar themes to other groups. I think the first question really drew out a lot of thoughtful comments about how we use our road space and, sort of the equity effect that the COVID pandemic has had, and really sort of the need to explore how we continue to make it equitable between the vehicles, rollers, and walkers going forward, and sort of thinking about some of our current projects and the need to link those to our sustainability priorities. And the second question really was all about people and neighborhoods and the need for the plan to be really representative of the city's residents and really designed for the community down to sort of the individual neighborhood level. We had lots of good comments around the need to include unrepresented voices and bringing all voices into the process, and also sort of raises questions around, how do we do long-term planning and current development and transportation planning at the same time. So a bit of a tension there.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Marissa Espinoza. Marissa?
I'm here, Andy.
Excellent.
How are you?
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll just report out that we talked a lot about the human experience of the city. So thinking about the neighborhood scale as an opportunity to create a sense of community, whether it's access to amenities such as playgrounds or outdoor spaces, or the opportunity to connect with one's neighbors. So that was really important. And an additional conversation was around power and privilege in decision-making, and how neighborhoods can be the training ground for expressions of democracy and civic engagement and civic literacy. So there's opportunities to really solidify the sense of community through neighborhood scale planning. And I'll paraphrase a bit by saying also participatory budgeting or decision-making around revenues and resources and how they're expended in the long run. We also talked about the importance of translation. Communication, because recognizing that we have a diversity of residents, and that's really important for people's sense of well-being, connection, and information. We also talked about the opportunity to really think about accessibility. So we gave examples of sidewalk accessibility and access to, again, public space as an important consideration for all abilities and ages. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. Corey Dobson.
Great, thanks a lot, Andy. Definitely a lot of parallels to all the previous presenters. One of the things that really stood out for me was with the group was really the focus on people. And so the decisions that we're making and really making sure that those are connected to the needs of the people who live here, whether it's around housing and thinking of it really as homes rather than just investments, as well as, I think, which other groups have talked about, really building public spaces and using our streets and our right-of-ways in ways that really support the needs of our communities. And as well, one of the things that was raised was commercial streets and making sure that our rights of ways are being used in ways that really support thriving commercial areas as well throughout the city. And the one other, I think, that jumped out was really around communication and access So both within decision-making and council processes in the COVID environment, and sort of clarity around, you know, how you get better access to that, both with council, but also with staff was brought up. And I think the one other piece was looking at how we connect this project across boundaries as well, and really really highlighting the kind of regional role as well that this process needs to play, and the decisions need to play to shape the future of the city and the region.
Great, thank you so much, Corey. Paula Huber. Paula.
Hi, Andy.
Hello.
So I was group 17. It was a small but thoughtful group of folks, and many of them had international living experience. So it was an interesting conversation. On the first question, what did they learn? What surprised them, and what did they learn over the first 8 months? They were surprised by the rapid shift to online, and look at us having a conference with 600 people today. Also surprised by the need to actually daily connect with others. You know, really aware of that, maybe more so than other times. Really important was that the access to nature and the outdoor space that our city provides has made Vancouver highly livable, more so than many other cities. That was a real strong observation by the group, especially a couple of people who had moved during the period of COVID. So strengthened by that. And on the second question, what advice to offer? There's an observation that a series of small changes across the city can collectively have a high impact, like many of the things that we've done during the COVID period collectively have had an impact and be transformative. And also just an ask that both housing and access to employment be a big consideration.
Great,
and that was it.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Paula. Susan Haid.
Thanks, Andy, and hi, everyone. We had, hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me?
5 you're good.
Okay, great. Yeah, we had a super thoughtful and diverse thought group, and I'm just going to touch on some of the key words and phrases. So the learnings and the experience of COVID, just some of the really tough challenges of isolation, loss of movement, loss of interaction with people, can't see the smiles I normally see, more resilient than I thought I was, more adaptive than I thought I was, and also really the experience of the tremendous deterioration in communities and civility. And this was really referring to not taking care of the most vulnerable in our communities, and just some of the impacts that we're seeing to marginalized communities, especially in the downtown east side. So some of the thoughts on that first question in terms of learnings just led to things like really strong need to support small businesses, strong need to support community connections and opportunities within our communities to connect in our community centers, our public spaces, ensuring that families can be supported and connected. And I think when we talked about the second question and advice to the city and for the future of the Vancouver Plan, it actually came down to 3 key aspects. The biggest one was the need for more affordable rental housing, and really emphasizing the need to shift away from a focus on ownership to rental housing for all, with serious focus on seniors, families, youth, and just ensuring that there's housing for all. So really a pivot in our housing supply and who it's for. The other 2 key components were support for small business, really the glue to our city and our communities, and support for community connections. Some of those things I referred to in the first aspect, in our neighborhoods, our community centers, senior centers, our services, our spaces.
Great.
I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. And last but not least, Gil Kelly, you are our closer.
Okay, love that role, Andy. Thank you. You know, our group was really kind of channeled 2 themes, if you will, and both those themes straddled your 2 questions. So I'll just talk about them thematically. One was really around enabling and fostering better engagement and dialogue going forward. And that had three kind of facets to it. One, really broad and important, which was really expanding the bandwidth and the engagement of youth and young people in everything the city does. Because after all, this work that we're talking about this evening is really creating a city in large part for them. And so engaging them in all facets of that. That was one. Two was a more transactional nature. That is to say, the ability to connect directly to staff rather than to the organization as a whole on things like critical development projects or planning programs or whatever it happens to be. The notion of kind of a loss of the direct contact was brewed by one of the speakers. And the third one was an observation that as the city organization has matured and created a robust communication function, that in many ways that served as mostly information out and not as welcoming as information back in. And so it doesn't feel like dialogue as much. So that was one channel. The other channel had to do with a kind of just do it philosophy. And that was a good example of where during COVID, the council reacted quickly to small business concerns, particularly for food and drink establishments, and did the temporary patio permit program, which in the one speakers I was very successful in. It just ought to encourage the city to take more risk and do things more quickly. We're in his eyes way too cautious most of the time. So I felt that was interesting too.
Thank you so much, Gil. And that we unfortunately missed out Catherine Neal. Catherine Neal, are you out there? Thank you so much, Gil. And we are waiting for Catherine Neal.
I'm here.
Catherine can be at least as good a closer as me, if not better. So.
I hate to take away your last final speaking points, but I do want to reiterate what my group said, and it's very much similar to what the other groups had said before. The importance of public space and nature and other civic facilities at this time has been very important, but also concerns around how we connect the downtown and the importance actually of civic knowledge and literacy so people can navigate the difficulties they've experienced through COVID. I did hear some great advice back about building empathy into our process. And actually, there was actually a request to have more constructive dialogues like this. So I'm hopeful for that in the future. And then also how we build empathy amongst community members that we involve in the process. So thank you for that. Thanks, Andy.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the City of Vancouver for coming out and supporting this event. I think that this has been a great collaboration between the City of Vancouver as well as I think the kind of, absolute amazing work done by SFU Public Square, Urban Studies, as well as the Van City Engagement Center over at SFU Woodwards. I don't know if there are any last minute comments from Meg, but that we also have a series of upcoming events, and to save the date for the Change We Want, the Change We Need events that we have forthcoming on January 21st. It's the theme will be housing. On February 11th, it's going to be complete neighborhoods. February 25th, economic health, and March 4th, reimagining streets. Thank you so much, everyone.
And also that's not the end of it, right? And Andy, is that there are more events and more opportunities in the works. I know Andy himself is cooking up some very compelling ideas about how to expand the conversation in a lot of the ways that we've talked about tonight. And I too, I'm so impressed by by everybody's willingness to meet us at a very constructive place with and thanks to our panelists, to Adriana, Ginger, Lisa, Gil, for coming here with your hearts and your minds open, and all of from the very minute feedback to the very broad systematic change. I think we appreciate it all.
Indeed, thank you so much. And maybe perhaps that beatbox shall be forthcoming depending on the behavior of our future panelists. And thank you so much, everybody. And that concludes our evening.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sticking it out with us for an extra half hour. See you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.